What is a RINO? Republican in name only. You hear this term all the time if you are in the conservative freedom liberty movement. And what does it mean to you? And I'm going to tell you what it means to me. So this idea of a RINO, Republican in name only, I hear this term a lot. And it's a pejorative term. It's a negative term. Nobody really likes being called a RINO in the Republican Party or on the conservative side of the political spectrum. Nobody likes that. I know that. And anybody watching this video knows that. So that's a negative term that is frequently used. Now, I first heard it when I was a college Republican back in the 90s. But when you look it up as a term that has been used on the Republican Party side for a long time, it really goes back almost 100 years. It's been a common term of a negative term that's been used within the party, and it kind of comes and goes in waves when it's popular at different times. And I don't remember using it as much as I hear it now, back when I was a college Republican, but we did use that as a term, usually referring to somebody that would pretend to be a Republican or claim to be, but really they didn't believe anything that we would imagine a conservative Republican would believe. And so that was kind of the division. I don't remember spending a lot of time, again, calling people that names, probably because I don't remember thinking that that was a super productive way of being a political activist when I was in college. But that term would come up, and I certainly had plenty of fights when I was in the college Republicans with the Republican leadership at the time. And even though I grew up in Washington State, living in New York City, and especially in Manhattan at that time as a conservative activist, that was a very difficult place to be an activist. It was not typically where you would think of conservative activism being. And so I understand this division very well. It's been around for a long time. But let's talk about it and see what it means. Now, when I talk to conservative activists who do use this term more than I do, they oftentimes, this is kind of the image and the idea that they have, this whole idea that people run for office and pretend that they are one thing, and then when they get into office, they totally become another. Oftentimes, you'll see this with Democrats who run for office and pretend like they believe in math or that they care about public safety, and then the minute they get in, math is gone and public safety is the lowest priority they can have. Or when you see Republicans running for office and they claim that they want to reduce government, and they get in there and they become a big government spender just like anybody else. Now that's frustrating. That's super frustrating. If you're an activist and you've been working on trying to change government or shrink it or restore liberty and freedom in some way, you care about the Second Amendment or the First Amendment or whatever your priorities are, when you see politicians do this, it's infuriating. And it drives you crazy. So, of course, the term RINO is oftentimes going to be used in settings like this, and it's probably appropriate for some politicians in certain settings. But I don't see it as a super effective way of growing and building your movement. And the counter to this is oftentimes Reagan's quote, where he says, hey, if you're on my side 80% of the time, it doesn't make you a 20% traitor. And that's a legitimate quote, and it's a legitimate point to make, because you win political movements, you win political fights by increasing the numbers of people on your side and reducing the numbers of people on the other side. That's how it works. You don't win political fights by purifying your side so much that you've shrunk yourself down to the last person who agrees with you, which is the person in the mirror. And there's no way to win in that way, especially if you're a bitter critter about it and you're angry at everybody. Not the way to grow your movement. You want to find ways of evangelizing liberty and freedom and convincing people that math is real, and getting Democrats to actually believe that math is real and crossing over and joining with you. These are the ways that you kind of expand your movement. Usually it's not by attacking people on your own side, or who are nominally on your own side anyway. And mainly it's because we're dealing with crazies. Oftentimes we're really fighting a significant fight against a serious enemy. And when I say enemy, I mean that in a political sense, because these people are destroying your future generations, your freedom, and your future, taking away your money with ridiculous taxes and regulations, destroying your opportunity moving forward, making public safety a distant memory, turning cities into war zones, destroying public education, you name it. This clown show seems to have it. So, and when you look at our state, and I'm reporting from Washington State, we have some really bad and terrible people. I mean, look at Governor Inslee. he certainly treats the rest of us like a little serf, little serfs out there, peasants for his kingly oversight, as a perpetual, endless emergency guy, and willing to lie all the time about taxes and pretty much everything else he does, losing $1 billion in his employment security department and nobody's looking into it. We have a lot of bad people in senior positions of government today. There's no shortage of weirdos and loons in government. And there's a lot of these people that we have to focus on. And it's going to be a lot harder to do that if you're spending your time attacking and fighting each other on your own side because somebody has one disagreement with you or you have a personality conflict, and that matters more to you than getting these crazies out of government. So that's the kind of thing that we end up having to deal with. And these guys are crazy. That's why I wrote an article a little while ago. When you elect clowns to government, don't be surprised when it turns into a circus. And oftentimes when you're looking at the Inslee administration and really almost every aspect of Washington state government, a lot of the local governments as well, essentially they operate like mountains of corruption concealed by oceans of incompetence. When you have that kind of thing going on, that's what you need to be fighting for. That's what you need to be fighting against. You need to be stopping it. You need to be trying to reverse it and change it. Now, it doesn't help when you have groups who are supposedly Republican going out and deciding that it's good to have to fight against reducing taxes. I thought that when the mainstream Republicans of Washington state decided to oppose the very popular initiative that easily passed in Washington state, despite the fact that millions of dollars were in opposition to it, I don't find that a super productive way of proving that you care about freedom and liberty. The clowns that get these tax dollars squander them, and anything we can do to reduce those tax dollars is usually a pretty good idea. And I just can't imagine that you're going to get a lot of leverage by doing something like that. It also doesn't make any sense to me that the Republican caucus would spend all its time attacking one of its own and deciding to remove Representative Sutherland from office rather than the fact that there's 14 to 15 other seats in the state that Democrats currently hold that in this red wave environment that's going on right now, and the voter revulsion towards the really absurd Democrat Party policies that have been shoved down their throats on homelessness and drug addiction and education and public safety and taxes and everything else, the mandates, all this stuff is driven like this massive turnout of people that are really frustrated with what's going on. Why are we spending our time and energy taking out another Republican? That just doesn't make sense to me. Nor does it make sense, like I was here at the Lincoln Day dinner in Lewis County, and I mentioned this in an earlier video, if one group, one faction's kind of taken over the Republican Party and they did a really good job running a Lincoln Day dinner and raised a lot of money, I think that should be part of internally managing your disagreements rather than having a fight, between factions, this faction friction that I've talked about before. Find a way to moderate that in a good way, not because you're going to give up on liberty and freedom and the priorities of shrinking government or fighting the terrible crazies that we have in government today, but because you need to come together if you're going to be able to have political success. There's really no other way to do it. And so it doesn't matter if you called yourself a Tea Partier in 2009 and you were marching on Washington, D.C. back then when it was a little bit less controversial to do so, apparently, or if you call yourself part of the American First agenda today. I think that whatever these various titles and labels, self-labels that people put on themselves, it isn't so critical as much as making sure that you can recognize that these guys right here are the ones that are really the problem that we're facing. We can't have such horrible and terrible people in government who are very happy to use the power that they are able to acquire into these positions to destroy public education, destroy your kids' future, try to indoctrinate them, make public safety just a part of history, or whatever other ways that these guys abuse their office every single day they go in. That's part of the problem, because if there's anything that Inslee wants, he doesn't want you to focus on him. He wants you to be in the middle of infighting and arguing whether somebody's a perfect enough conservative or not, whether they're Christian or not, whether they're perfect enough in that process or not, or whether they agree with you or not. You want them to agree with you most of the time, and if you can get people to agree with you most of the time, in my opinion, that's kind of good enough. So then the question comes down, how would I define a Republican name only? And I don't use that term. You can watch. I've hardly ever talked in that way. But because the term's used a lot, I'll use it in this instance. What am I really talking about here as a Republican in name only? Well, I would rarely use the term, but when I use it, it would really be focus on people who decide to spend more of their time infighting than fighting the left. Because if that's how you have to spend your time, then you're not actually moving the ball forward down the field in a freedom and liberty direction. You're just spending it sacking your own quarterback and causing problems in your own side. If you refuse to do anything to advance liberty and freedom, and all you do is sit back there and attack other people who are nominally on your own side, again, same thing. And you can't get to Reagan's 80% if you spend 90% of your time attacking people who are nominally on your own side. I'd call that a RINO, I guess, Republican in name only, because you're clearly not advancing the conservative movement. And the conservative movement matters more to me than the Republican Party, but and freedom and liberty certainly matter more to me than the Republican Party. But at this point in time, the Republican Party is usually the vehicle through which you're going to be able to move in that direction. Clearly, the Democrat Party's abandoned freedom and liberty long ago. And I think for those who consider themselves, they're afraid of this new activism wave that's going on out there all the time, you have to recognize that just because you aren't willing to drive around with an impeach Inslee sign in the back of your truck doesn't mean that you need to attack the people who are willing to do that. Just because you aren't willing to put out a Inslee is scum banner on the state capitol lawn and bring it around there all the time doesn't mean that other people can't do that. And I think you have to be a little bit more open-minded and recognize that there needs to be a broader tent of activism and people who want to get out there and get engaged, especially when they're new to the political process. Because if what we do is spend our time obsessing about others who aren't as pure or perfect as we think we are in the political movement, then you don't learn, and we're right in the middle of a red wave. I think the Democrats I don't think really the leadership of either political party is aware of what's coming, but certainly the Republicans need to recognize that if you're going to take advantage of a red wave in a state that's been nominally blue, where it seems reasonably likely that the Republicans can take over one or both houses if they get their act together, why would you want to spend your time right now fighting each other and just get kicked by the very corrupt Democrat Party that has been running the state for a long, long time? There's no reason to do that. Just because you've got these infighting problems doesn't mean, and everybody can't agree, that Inslee's got to go, right? We can't have nuts like this guy running the state in his just weird and bizarre way. It's just getting more surreal all the time. You have to be able to come together on some of these things. Because when it comes to people, just average people out there, people like this, they don't really care about the infighting. They're sick of it. They really have gotten involved. When I do these training sessions, 80% of the people are brand new to political activism. I see it all around the state all the time. They don't care about these divisions so much within the conservative, Republican, libertarian, freedom-oriented side of things. They just need to get the loons out of government. They just need to downsize the abusive government experience that they're having. They just actually want schools that are functional in some way. They want to restore literacy to the education system, which has been removed apparently. They want their communities to be safe, and they don't want to be paying an arm and a leg for it. They don't want inflation through the roof, right? They want the things that we all can generally agree on the liberty-freedom side of the equation. And we don't need to go and have pitched battles amongst ourselves, calling each other names. And if we do that, you're going to have a lot of these new people who don't want anything to do with that. They're very, very focused on trying to save the state and the country for their family and the future. And I think it's important that those of us who've been doing this a little bit longer, that we at least work hard to minimize that the friction of the factions that are inevitable in the political process. We don't need to make more drama than is already there naturally. We don't need to take our personality conflicts and turn them into scorched earth campaigns. And I don't find it super helpful to call each other names. I just think that we have to recognize that freedom and liberty matters more than any of these opinions or thoughts that we have. And we all have to come together to push back on it, or else freedom and liberty loses in the end. So if you want to learn more, go to wethegovern.com. Please feel free to subscribe to my free newsletter down below. Feel free to share this video with others. I'm really curious in your feedback. Feel free to, if you think I'm totally wrong and delusional, feel free to say that down below. Love comments, whether you agree with me or not, and I'll try to respond to as many of them as I possibly can. And with that, no matter what you do, whether you agree with me or not, please make sure that you engage in this political process. It really does matter. Nothing's going to happen if you stay home, because the future belongs to those who show up.